back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and this is our weekly hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to people of African descent and others fighting to build a better society. As you've no doubt been paying attention to in the past several months, there have been a number of stories in the news here in the United States and beyond dealing with tensions between Latino communities and African U.S. communities. Certainly what happened out in Los Angeles with the chairperson of the city council, Nuri Martinez, caught on tape with two other council people, Kevin De Leon and Gil Cedillo, making remarks that led to her resignation. In fact, Council Chair Martinez's resignations exacerbated some tensions between Black and brown communities, for lack of a better phrase. And then, of course, recently with the release of the film Wakanda Forever, we've seen the co-star of the movie, Tina Corerta, himself an indigenous Latino, raise issues of colorism in Hollywood and intra-ethnic tensions as it relates to race and color in the Spanish-speaking world. Well, we have been anticipating this visit for quite some time. We are very happy to invite here to the Black Table Professor Tanya Catari Hernandez, who is the Archibald Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University. She's done stints at George Washington University, Rutgers Camden, UPenn, Brooklyn Law School, St. John's, among others. She is globally known. I don't know how she fit us into her schedule, but we're very glad that she did. She was, as recently as 2019, was elected Professor of the Year there at Fordham. And she teaches and researches and writes and trains in areas moving from anti-discrimination law to comparative law, particularly discrimination law, critical race theory, which she's been teaching for a generation, and any number of other areas, including implicit bias training. She has worked on several continents. She's worked throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, from Brazil to Trinidad to Puerto Rico, the homeland of her ancestors. She's worked at the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador, Brazil. Of course, the Afro-Brazilians are there. And so, without any further ado, let's welcome here to discuss this question of her addressed in her most recent book, Racial Innocence: Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. Let's welcome Professor Tanya Catari Hernandez. Welcome, Professor Hernandez. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Oh, listen, it's a blessing. In fact, because I am not a Spanish speaker, would we say here, la mesa negra? What would we say to the Black Table in Spanish?
La mesa negra.
Okay, so we might have to add that, because we're going to address this anti-Black stuff in the Spanish-speaking world. So maybe we need to put that in our intros from now on. It's so nice to have you. Prof, you know, and being a little bit familiar with your previous books, particularly the multiracial book, Multiracials, and dealing with mixed race studies and critical race theory, I wonder if you wouldn't mind using the point of entry, interestingly enough, that you kind of lay out in the epilogue of Racial Innocence, maybe using your personal story and how you grapple with this. Would you mind kind of introducing us to the world of anti-Black racism in the Spanish-speaking world and how it manifests, and what exactly is racial innocence?
Well, you know, it's interesting because all these years, and it's fascinating to hear you reflect back to me that I've been teaching critical race theory for a generation.
Well, I didn't want to put a number on it because I watched a couple of interviews and you put a number on it. You said, well, maybe longer than that. And I said, okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to let you take it.
Well, it's actually even more inspiring to me to hear it that phrased that way, you know, that it's right. I've been trying my hardest to try to influence, you know, an entire generation and more to come. And so that's very exciting. It's nicer to think of it that way as opposed to a number of years going by. And so, I mean, I bring that up just simply to say that my approach to these topics is always to view them through a systemic lens, because that's the way critical race theory has formed me. And I think that is so important. You don't understand racism unless you think about it as a system and systems. But the family is also a system.
Yes.
And so what I do in the book is, you know, I let people know that, you know, the family is the scene of the crime when it comes to learning the rules of engagement of racism and anti-Blackness in particular. And I have a whole, section in the beginning to talk about sort of how in people's memoirs, Afro-Latino, Latine memoirs, this comes up, right? These issues of feeling the brunt of displeasure in the family for being the dark one. The dark one could be any particular kind of shade. As long as you're too dark for a particular family, you are the dark one. But I wait until the very end in the epilogue to share my own personal story, because I didn't want it to distract from people thinking, oh, well, she's just here to tell her story. That's what this book is about. And it's not. It's not an autobiography. It's not about churning everything through my own personal narrative. But at the same time, I thought it was only fair that I was sharing the details of other people's stories to have parity, or they were being vulnerable, I could be vulnerable as well.
Listen, if you want to take it, we can take it any kind of way you want. It's so funny. We were in law school around the same time, and I remember Derek Bell coming to campus at Ohio State, where I was, and talking about the fact that at the center of critical race theory are narratives, are stories. And of course, Professor Crenshaw blurbs your book, calling it a tour de force through this. And I remember when I was clerking at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund one summer and reading one of her early articles and really being brought aware to this. So what you've done in this text, kind of, combining qualitative and quantitative research, it really is quite a remarkable text. I mean, if you want to wait until later on to do we following your lead, Prof. So we don't have to enter with you. I mean, we can certainly, in the first chapter, when you lay out this phrase, it's really fascinating, the materiality of Latino bias. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, so we take it any kind of way you want to, Prof. I just want to let you know, you don't have to start with me.
If you hear any reluctance on my part, it's simply because so much of my story is from my mother's story. And so I'm just she gave me complete authorization to use those details. And I'm not speaking out of turn, to share those details, but I'm also trying to be attuned to the way in which, if she sort of, she's an internet person, and so, for her to have to constantly be assaulted by hearing the trauma of her own upbringing over and over again. So that's what I'm trying to be. I try to be careful about how much I sort of repeat it.
Let's take it that way then. I mean, when you talk about the materiality of Latino bias, and by the way, those of you who are students, whether you be K-12, but particularly undergrad students, law students, graduate students, your attention to detail and being very careful and loving in a way to deal with people's personal stories and how you kind of manage that. I mean, that's a hallmark that we should all follow. Those of us who are academics and scholars in particular, but people generally. There's a humanity at the core of this book. So I appreciate you even saying that. So maybe we can start with chapter 1. I mean, what is racial innocence? And when we talk about Afro-Latino bias, there are going to be a lot of people watching this to say, but they're all Latinos. So it is racism, and I don't know. I mean, so maybe we can start there if you want to help us.
It's interesting when people ask me about this. Sometimes they say, "Oh, were you channeling James Baldwin?" And certainly that's the master, right? None of us thinks of things all in a vacuum. That we are all the product of the influences of those who came before us. And so, Baldwin was very early to talk about sort of the way in which racial innocence kills, right? That is to say, the mentality of having oneself be strategically oblivious, right, to all the ways in which there are racial hierarchies, and that those racial hierarchies have actual consequences of exclusion and, of course, inclusion for those who are at the very top. I use that framing of innocence in a very particular manner. I want for a Latine audience to be able to sort of put aside all their usual defenses, right? And so I use this idea, the Latino racial innocence cloak, right? So what do we shield ourselves with and from, to describe how Latine who view themselves as, or our community, maybe better put our community as being racially mixed and thus not bogged down by the binaries of Black versus white. I use that in a very facetious way. Because all along, we're very attentive to the differences between white and Black. There's almost a hypervigilance with regards to any kinds of signs of Blackness within one's phenotype, hair texture, etc., and certainly within that of others. And so the Latino racial innocence cloak is the use of this trope of we are also racially mixed. We can't possibly be discriminatory because we don't know Black and we don't know white. That's an American thing, a North American thing.
Right.
We are innocent of all that. We are innocent of Jim Crow segregation. That's your problem, not our problem. Okay. And with that racial innocence cloak, we then don't take any responsibility for the ways in which Latina can be part and parcel of the problem.
So then, I mean, as you lay this out, this Latino anti-Blackness in areas, you know, from perception to behavior to the legal universe, and you do deep dives and everything from employment discrimination to, and I love, by the way, how you rename the Mother Murphy's exception, the boarding house exception, in the chapter on housing discrimination and renting and purchasing homes. You know, how does this anti-Black? Well, first of all, maybe help us understand, because those of us who are Afro, I suppose, for lack of a better term, Afro-Anglo, who were brought here to the United States or eventually ended up here, may not be aware that we are a fraction, a tiny, tiny minority of the Africans who were deposited in this hemisphere. I mean, where did this notion of anti-Blackness come from in your estimation? How much of it has to do with that process of enslavement and how Blackness was created?
Well, I mean, it's colonialism, right? The colonial imperialist project is a huge factor, right? In the way in which anti-Blackness gets its own justification scheme. The rationalizations for like why these people are at the bottom, we didn't put them there. They just inherently need to be there. Their own deficiencies are what have them be at the bottom. They have some talent, but only a talent for particular things, servile positions, etc. And so while, you know, the legacy of slavery is a very strong one, like 90%, some historians say, of the Africans who were forcibly brought to Las Americas, the Americas, were forcibly brought to Latin America and the broader Caribbean. And those are just the ones that survived the Middle Passage, right? So, you know, these numbers are really quite significant.
So that's really something. I mean, because so those of us who end up directly coming here to the United States, not only are we a fraction of the group that is brought, but the notion of anti-Blackness really, in some ways, I don't want to overburden it, but seems like to me it's probably was formed most broadly in the Latin world, the Spanish-speaking world, the French-speaking world, I mean, some of the English-speaking world. But, you know, you then begin to track out how this thing manifests in contemporary times. This question of violences, teen violence, people fighting in schools, media representation, people in the workplace denying folk who speak Spanish. I'm in the Spanish-speaking world, but I can't get a promotion. You keep calling me these names. I mean, help us walk through some of this. How does this anti-Blackness manifest in real life, the real life lives of Spanish-speaking community?
Well, the thing to keep in mind is that wherever we see Latine who have some form of discretionary power, they're employers. They are homeowners. They are housing managers, right? All the places where power is exercised and there's discretion being manifested. Where Latine are in those positions, and typically where there are large numbers of Latine as well. So meaning there is a demographic presence of a community that supports these attitudes. That seemed to be a pattern that I saw in so many of the cases that I looked into. You will have manifestations of anti-Blackness. Now, some people say to me, is it different? You know, is it different the way Latinos do it as opposed to the way other people do it? I'm like, exclusion is exclusion. It doesn't feel kind of sexier to have it said in Spanish. It's still problematic. And certainly the results are the same. And so that's why I use law cases, not so much to educate everybody about the details of anti-discrimination law, though you will learn a little something about that, you know, as a reader as you go along, for those, you know, who don't already know that and have that background. But the book is much more about using the cases almost as a literary frame for intervening into the Latino disinclination to take responsibility and acknowledge the anti-Blackness that exists in our communities. And secondly, to create an awareness to the broader population outside of Latine about the way in which people of color, in this, my case study, Latine, are part of, complicit in anti-Blackness, not because they've been taught anti-Blackness in the United States, but because we enter into the United States already with our own forms of anti-Black ideologies well intact. Right? And that's why in the book I bring together both Afro-Latinos and African-Americans and other people from the African diaspora who are victims of Latine anti-Blackness, because otherwise, when you deal with all these groups separately, there's a whole set of justifications that we have for, African American versus Latino. That's about cultural misunderstanding, or it's about political power grabs and turf wars. If you say it's about, if you look at Afro Latinos, you can't use the cultural misunderstanding excuse. What you instead use is, well, where we come from, it's unfortunate, but the Afro population is poor. And so we have a problem of poverty. We don't have a problem of racism. So every of these populations has some set of excuses. When you bring all these populations together who are of African descent, but share the commonality, right, of experiencing Latine anti-Blackness, it becomes harder and harder to use those same old tired excuses.
Thank you. Well, when we come back in a moment, we'll get a little bit deeper into some of the examples that you use, Professor Hernandez, and get us a wider lens and how you kind of drill down into how these anti-Black forms persist and how they manifest in the world. We'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table on the Black Star Network.
I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show, Get Wealthy, focuses on the things that your financial advisor and bank isn't telling you, but you absolutely need to know. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Star Network. As you can see, we're engaging in a fascinating conversation on Tanya Katari Hernandez's new book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. Prior, when we paused, you were walking us through the various ways that these anti-Black behaviors persist. In that second chapter, you take us from, is it Social Friday in Puerto Rico to a Denny's in Miami, and then to the schools. I mean, and you kind of laid this out for us, but when we think Latino, unfortunately, and you make a distinction between ethnicity and race, and think about everybody who speaks Spanish isn't from the same place, but was there a reason that you started in, I almost want to say, well, like Washington, D.C., one of the colonies of the United States, Puerto Rico, so that nobody could mistake, as you were saying just before the break, this bias, this kind of racism with cultural misunderstanding?
Well, Puerto Rico is useful in a number of ways for this particular study. One, it is a location in which the population is very adamant, right, about maintaining their culture, right, their pride. Anybody who's ever met a Puerto Rican, no matter where we are, you see the red boot flag wrapped around us, right? Either literally or metaphorically. Right? I think it's a single Bad Bunny video where there's not some flag waving somewhere. So, that's right. Boricua pride. So it's useful in that way, meaning that the culture is very intentionally Latine, right? That it's, yes, there are North American aspects to the North American territory that the island of Puerto Rico is, but it is prideful about having Latine culture. Yes. At the same time, it is a U.S. property. And as a U.S. property, U.S. federal law applies. So all the anti-discrimination law and all the frames of anti-discrimination are available, right, to the Puerto Rican population. So it's a very fascinating space, as a researcher, I have to be perfectly frank, but, also as a Puerto Rican to do this study, because when you start out with this idea of like, okay, here are the native forms, right, very clearly, right, within Puerto Rico itself, of how anti-Blackness is manifested in ways that for a U.S. reader sounds very familiar, right? Oh, we don't have any space for you here at the restaurant, or, oh, the kitchen is closed, or, oh, wait right there. We'll get to you when we can. While every white person is walking through without a reservation, right? Yes. So the back to sort of this earlier question, like, is it different, when it is anti-Blackness in Spanish? No, right? The racism stings, right? It cuts and harms, regardless of, what language it's spoken in. But I thought it was useful to start the book, or I should say start that chapter about the public accommodations from a Latino deeply entrenched cultural space, and then show the way in which those spaces are constantly being recreated within the continental United States. So that, when you jump to Miami, it's like, oh yeah, the what's considered the capital of Latin America is Miami. But there are little Miamis, right, all over the country. They may not get the same kind of hype. They're not tourist destinations, but there's spaces in which Latino aggregate together and inculcate across generations some of these very same anti-Black attitudes. So this notion of, oh, well, it's just like antiquated issue that only the old people are carrying on. Once that's handled, we won't have those problems anymore. But younger generations are just as incomplete with some of these issues of anti-Blackness.
Yes, and I mean, as you write, I mean, there's family, there's community, but there's also media and attitudes, and you write about that as well. And looking for the sources of these kind of persisting issues. In the third chapter, you take us to employment law. I thought it was interesting how you lined out the case of Edward Olumina, I think, who is Nigerian American, and then you follow that with Jose Arocha, who is Panamanian, Afro-Panamanian, and a layered lens. I mean, you got a person who is the descendant of continental Africans, direct descendant, but raised in the United States, so African American, but Nigerian American, and Afro-Panamanian, both of whom suffer discrimination on the job at the hands of Latinos. Help us understand, is there a distinction to be made between Blackness when it is coming from somebody who's born in the United States, Blackness when it's coming from somebody who's born somewhere else? Are there differences in attitude from those who come to the United States, Latinos who come to the United States, as opposed to those who were born and raised here? I mean, it's so layered. Help us, if you can, walk us through some of that.
Well, certainly the ethnic aspects of Blackness are certainly diverse, right? So that to be Black in Selma, Alabama feels, different, right, than to be Black in Dakar, in Senegal, right? The cultural aspects of what we think of as Blackness vary. That's just the beauty of culture. That doesn't mean that there's not a parallel through line. We wouldn't have Black Table, right? That wouldn't make sense if there were not, right, these very common issues of anti-Blackness that is us Black, right? That we are blackened in the world because of these tropes, right, of anti-Blackness. That being the case, though, when looking at the workplace, right, what is so fascinating is that people come from different places, right? Olumia was, as far as I can recall, a not so recent, or I should say more recent immigrant to the United States, coming from Nigeria. Jose Arrocha was a less recent immigrant from Panama, right? But also with a Black identity. So the reason why I reiterate that they did not necessarily have what we might think of as an Afro-American identity, right? Meaning not that they reject Blackness, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as I'm Black in the African-American sense of the communal sense of the word, right? Because their culture is different, because they just, they've only been here for a short time, etc. However, this is what I think is the beauty of using the anti-discrimination law cases as a frame for sort of like, or as my young people tell me, you bring in the receipts, Professor Hernandez, right, for bringing the receipts regarding these issues. It's because regardless of whether or not you're thinking in that way, when you experience anti-Blackness, it brings clarity. Right? And for both of these individuals, what they discover is that their racial appearance, right, when they are blackened by the racial appearance, or I should say the racial experience of being differentiated and viewed as less than, right, not the best worker, not even viewed as a worker who should be in the space that they found themselves in. So they're constantly experiencing harassment and different forms of sort of being pushed out and exclusion in the case of outright termination.
Yes.
And so, I just say like this, that even with all the cultural variations of the beauty, right, that is Blackness, in big tent culture of what Black culture is, there's a flatten that happens when, because discrimination is crude. It's meant to be some nuance of sophisticated form of experience and to demean your humanity. And so there are, very unfortunate commonalities with the way in which each of these individuals, and more in the book, and the book is about the projects of amplifying, the voices of victims of the Afro-Latina, of Latina anti-Blackness. There's this commonality with regards to what they experience and how.
Well, thank you, Prof. When we come back after the break, we want you to explore some of that as it manifests itself in the courtroom and in life, whether it be the jury box, be the judge's chambers, how it manifests this anti-Black racism. So we'll be in a moment with Professor Tanya Hernandez and racial innocence here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
We're all impacted by the culture, whether we know it or not. From politics, music, and entertainment, it's a huge part of lives. And we're going to talk about it every day right here on The Culture with me, Raji Muhammad, only on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Always remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, tell your friends. We're growing leaps and bounds. We already got a big global audience, and we're glad to add you to the family. Prof, when we left, we were talking about how this manifests, and I'm wondering, since you spent time in the chambers of a district judge, clerk for federal judge, you talk about who the judge is and why that matters. I remember when Sonia Sotomayor, who I always want to claim, I know she's not, but they said, oh, Ketanji Brown Jackson, wait, no, Sotomayor is Puerto Rico. But I remember she came to Howard Law shortly after she took the bench at the Supreme Court, and she talked about the fact that in New York, she liked to have immigrants in the box when she was trying to put somebody away. And you write about how sometimes Latino judges can impose their biases on people who do screw up the curve, figure out a way to get to court to work on discrimination. And you also talk about why folks who serve on juries can suffer from that same type of misinterpretation to assign a racial innocence to Latinos and say, well, this couldn't be racial discrimination because they're all Latinos. Could you talk about what happens in the courtroom if, in fact, some folks, some kind of way, find their way into a courtroom to kind of protest and say, no, I've been discriminated against?
Well, here what I think was important to underscore is that the laws of anti-discrimination apply just the same when it is a Latina person who is being accused of being aggressor at the cause of the anti-Blackness. Sometimes people think laws, no, the law works just fine. The problem is when it's being interpreted as having an exception, an off-ramp Latina subjects. Right? So it's a Latino just but judges generally. What we need to be careful of, or I to call it drinking the Kool-Aid, right? The pathological nonsense, right, that gets spouted within Latino communities about sort of how much more enlightened we are with regards to issues of race, because we mix and we don't know white and we don't know black. And so those judges then allow Latinos who are accused of racism of no further inquiry, right? The case dismissed. There's not a real claim here because, you're incapable of being racist. So that's a problem. Then there's also the jurors. Jurors who are not provided with racial literacy about the ways in which people of color are also culpable with regards to issues of discrimination. They too can come under the lure, right, of the seduction, right, of this idea of the mythology, right, of Latinos as these racially mixed exceptions to issues of discrimination.
Wow.
And Latino judges are no less of a problem, right? The Latino judges, in some respects, it's sort of an interesting dynamic, and I like to look at Latino judges not in the continental United States and in Puerto Rico itself. What you find is that sometimes the very identity of being Afro-Latino, of being Latino, normalizes anti-Blackness so much that it's even harder, right, to push against. Right? Because for these judges to mention the notion of both Blackness is bad, but two, it's the fault of Black, right, writ large, Afro-Latino, African-American, others of the African diaspora. And I am a possibility of discrimination, and so everything I think and view about these topics must be righteous, right? Because I too am a person of color, right? So there's a multiplicity of layers here, right, that can interfere with readily addressing the anti-Blackness that is brought to court, even though the law that we have on the books is perfectly adequate vet and suss out what are the meritorious claims, which are the ones that need to be resolved and provided some form of recourse.
It's interesting. I remember being in a conversation with some law students many years ago who were from Atlanta, and they were talking about colorism. Title VII. How are we going to deal with employment discrimination when both sides are Black? Now that manifests itself in the Spanish-speaking world too. Now I love to thank you for making sure we understand that Latino judges are not an exception to racism is operating. So, but does colorism play a role in it?
Colorism is a fascinating area here because it is its own category of discrimination for purposes of Title VII, for instance. So we include you can't discriminate against somebody because of race, color, national origin, etc. And so a person who doesn't view themselves as having a racial identity, but perceives that they have been excluded or diminished in the workplace, for instance, because of their skin color, they can have a claim. Yes. What is fascinating, right, is that empirically speaking, and I have a colleague named Lavelle Banks, emeritus for the University of Maryland Law School, who assessed the ways in which when African Americans bring colorism claims, so they say that the African American was the one who was biased based on their skin color, they have a lower win rate than when Latino these colorism claims. But, and here's where I did deeper research, and what I discovered is that the cases that those Latinos are winning are ones in which they say, I'm a Latino and this white Anglo person discriminate against me based on color.
Interesting.
But when it is Latinos talking about Afro-Latinos, there's as much incoherence, right, as for the judges as when they're confronted with African Americans within African American workplace, where the co-workers are other African Americans and supervisors who may be maintaining a pigmency, a hierarchy based on skin color.
Yes, and you've done so much training and so much consulting with so many different type groups, and you talk about how to perhaps help jurors get beyond that. What's your experience with helping judges? How can we help judges to kind of get past that?
Well, judges get annual training as well. They go to judge school, it's a profession. They go for continuing legal education. Often it's pushed into their place of work, so they don't have to travel if they don't want to. It is them, or sometimes like little boondocks, they take a trip. And so, but it's to say they are part of the spectrum of getting more information. And in fact, I was doing this research very early on. So I hadn't taken on housing and public accommodations, education, and criminals. I'd only been looking at the workplace because there's enough going on in the workplace that occupies many hours of research. When I started that, one of the first publications I published the findings in was the ABA, the American Bar Association journal, because what I wanted was for an opportunity to push out the ideas amongst those who are marshaling these cases in the courtroom. And even where there's a jury involved, the judges are there on the scene deciding what the jury gets to hear, what they don't get to hear. So to say that something, it's a jury trial, so what the judges are not as important. The judge is always important in the case, whether or not they're the ultimate decision maker or not.
Yes, and now that you've kind of given us this broad spectrum of how this operates, how race operates, and of course in the chat where you deal with housing, you talk about a black tax perhaps being imposed depending on how folk want to rent or sell to Afro-Latinos or African Americans. But I guess maybe as we kind of wrap this segment and move toward the final one, I'm wondering if you say a word about what you call in chapter 5 Latino white supremacists. I mean, you mentioned Alex Ramos, of course, from Virginia, and I don't know that everybody knew early on that George Zimmerman was Peruvian. But what are Latino white supremacists, Rob?
Well, unfortunately, Latinos are part of a growing trend of enrolling in white supremacist organizations, right? The chair of the Proud Boys is a Cuban American. Ramos of Charlottesville, Unite the Right, or they call them Unite the Whites. I think it's one of them, right? So when I use that term, white supremacist, I'm not using it in a dramatic sense of the word. I'm using it literally, right? These are Latinos who join these organizations, flying the flag of, sometimes a Nazi flag, if you will. It's very deep. Now, are they the majority of Latinos? No, but no people the majority of the United States that we know of. And so the reason why I bring them anyway, myself, if they're an outlier, what are they doing in the book? They belong in the book because of the way in which there are all these excuses about how Latinos are not susceptible somehow, right? They've got this racial innocence Teflon shield, right? So that they're not susceptible to all the problems of Blackness. Well, if they're part of white supremacist organizations, Teflon shield is not operating very well at all. And indeed, when did we find out about George Zimmerman's background? Not because, right? but because when his family and his mother in particular were seeking to say, "Oh no, our beloved George, he was just defending the property. Trayvon, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This wasn't about him being black, right? This wasn't about racism." They bring out as part of their it wasn't about racism because George is Latino. He's got these Peruvian family members. And so that makes him an exception to the idea that it could possibly be about racism. That's when we find out, right, that he has this Peruvian background. So it's this deployment, right, of the Latino position as exception right? That I find so problematic, and that I'm hope book can provide greater clarity about.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and that clarity and that understanding and the basis for changing this and transforming this that you thread through the book, you really bring it all home in the last part of the book. And when we come back after the break, we hope you will help us kind of piece through what we do to address a very real question that many folk, too many, in fact, may not and probably were not aware existed. So we'll be back in a moment at the Black Table with Professor Tanya Kateri Hernandez, talking about racial innocence and posing solutions. Back at the Black Table. Pull up a chair, take your seat. The Black Table with me, Dr. Greg Carr, here on the Black Star Network. Every week, we'll take a deeper dive into the world we're living in. Join the conversation only on the Black Star Network. Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Always support the Black Star Network. And we are wrapping up today with Fordham Professor Tanya Kateri Hernandez. Prof, you really, I mean, there's so many other things we could ask you about. Given the landscape, and you kind of map out the census in terms of who's living here in the United States, where the United States is going in the next generation or two, where it already is. You talk a lot about, near the end of the book, particularly chapter 6, about unity mapping in politics. And given the election cycle we just passed, what happened in Florida and Texas, any thoughts on how we begin to forge coalition politics that involve addressing the very issues you've talked about throughout this book?
Well, I have to say I was very encouraged when, after the debacle in the LA City Council occurred, that the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Janae Nelson, and the head of the Latino Justice Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, Lourdes Rosado, came together and co-hosted a community forum. And I believe they did it virtually so that as many people as possible could join in, because what they were wanting to do was to be able to, one, contextualize what had gone down in LA, but also sort of start to try to repair those bridges, because now, with the echo of those audio tapes, leaving a very strong imprint of the anti-Black sentiment that can exist within Latino communities, they didn't want that to create a continued additional barrier that would be hard to remove. So, that was very encouraging. That being said, Latine and African Americans in particular have had long histories of, forging coalitions in local spaces and working together. Right? So, mine is not a book of like bad.
I loved, it's interesting. One more time was in Colorado at the charter school started by Jorge Gonzalez and the Chicano movement. And you talk about that in the book. The majority of Spanish speaking folk in the United States of America, you say, are really from Central America, particularly Mexico, right? I mean, so yeah, it's very encouraging when you draw on that experience from the 60s. And well, not just from the 60s, obviously, but I mean, you do ground it. So I just wanted to interject that because, yeah, people might think, oh, it's just, no, not at all. But please, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go right ahead.
So, I reference that to say that, this is not some kind of impossible thing to do. We have done it, right? And we can continue to do it. But what I would say is that what needs to be different, right, about the way we do the coalitions in the future, because so often they have been very temporal, right? About a particular issue, often police violence, right? Police racially motivated violence within various communities, which, needs as much coalition as possible to be able to combat it. However, once sort of like, people move on from the recent death, they lose steam, and so does the coalition. In order to have sort of long-standing, long-lasting coalitions, I think we need to be honest, right, about the ways in which racial attitudes are prevalent, right? Meaning that simply because we have a commonality with regards to, for instance, racially motivated police violence, doesn't mean that we aren't busy putting one another in a pecking order, right? And that needs to be vocalized, because when it's not, it's still operating, it's still doing work, but it's left in the shadows unaddressed. But we've got to bring that stuff out into the light if we want to be able to actually adequately address it.
Prof, can I ask you right quick? Because I mean, you just, when you said that, it triggered a memory of something you wrote in the book. This question of the racial bride. I mean, even though we're talking about, racism, whiteness is at the center of this thing. So, I mean, how do we devalue whiteness so that folks aren't lured into this idea that perhaps we can get a little closer to it? And I wanted to ask you that in the context of the fact that you've done so much work throughout the hemisphere, the Spanish-speaking world, the English-speaking world, Portuguese-speaking world. So you have a comparative framework informed by your direct experience. Is the United States catching up to the Latin world in terms of how these racial hierarchies operate? And how do we displace whiteness as the kind of organizational logic that triggers all this stuff?
Well, what's so fascinating to me is that, I talk about these issues, in any number of contexts. And often I'm met with people who are like, this Afro-Latino thing, this seems very new. Like, where'd this come from? Why are people talking about this now? Right? Is it just copying African Americans? Like, what is this? And what it is a lack of knowledge, right, about the way in which people operate across the diaspora. Right? So Afro-Latino is a term that kind of slowly gets evolved from the social justice activists within Latin America, who are seeking a way to bring together people of African descent, regardless of whether they themselves identify as, shall we say, blackity black, right? Or if they only identify as like, well, I got some relatives, or I got a little bit of something, but, I'm not black like African Americans, because they only think that blackness is an African American cultural prototype, right? Afrodescendiente, Afro-descendant, and then down to Afro-Latino is a more sort of a broader encompassing word, or at least that's what it was hoping to be, within the Latin American region for bringing together people for anti-racism and anti-blackness. Right? Mm-hmm. And then that body of sort of communication comes into the United States, and Latine in United States, in conversation with people with Latin America, start to bring in the Afro-Latino subject, right? And so, why am I talking about this in response to the question about whiteness and the seduction of whiteness as a racial bribe and what have you? It seems to me that you cannot talk about whiteness without also talking about anti-blackness, right? I mean, that these two things are part of a problematic puzzle, right? That we have of long standing. And so part of what I also find very encouraging, is that in 2001, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, had so many Latin American representatives who showed up, right? They showed up in vast numbers, in allegiance with and supported by many international human rights agencies. You can put your money where your mouth is. And they did so because what they wanted was for there to be greater attention to the globality of anti-blackness, right? And so, you can't really disrupt the lure of whiteness without putting it into conversation with anti-blackness. And too often, I think there is this idea of, well, why are we talking about anti-blackness again? There's so many other people who are suffering. Okay, that's true. But that doesn't mean we solved anti-blackness because you're tired of hearing about it, right? And certainly, it is more than just a U.S. problem. It's a global problem.
Yes, with global solutions. I love the way you end the book with this prayer, Ojala y Ache. Could you explain what that is to us, Prof, and how just that global mix is just in that little phrase?
Well, more people may be familiar with the Arabic intonation with regards to Ojalá. This is in Spanish, Inshallah.
Oh,
right? Because that's really what it means. It's so be it. Let it be. right? And so the ojalá, the inshallah, comes after the invocation about, I hope that, whatever your own personal histories are with race and racism, because I'm not speaking to just one kind of an audience, I'm hoping that you get something from this book to increase your racial literacy to help in the struggle against racism. Ojalá, inshallah, let it be. And then the ashe ties into actually the cover of the book as well, because on the cover of the book is a black fist, and all people think, oh, is that the Black Power fist? Well, but it's also is to ward off the bad juju, right? Because we have talked about this during our little time here, but I do get a lot of pushback, often from white identifying Latinos and Latine folks. And the book was the book cover, and the ashe was like, let me ward off the evil eye from those folks.
And I see now, even with the fist behind it, that looks almost like an Okpele chain from Ifa. I mean, oh, you got the juju going on. I didn't even realize that until you said it. Oh.
And it was interesting because, part of it was the publisher was like, oh, well, why do you want this? And I explained why I wanted the first. I explained what an azabache was and why I wanted it on the cover, right? And, for some people, be like, well, this is sort of like a reference not many people are going to get. But, sometimes it's the power of the when you know. And I want to put the shout out there for the people who knew who were going to know or who would want to learn what it was.
No question. Well, Professor Tanya Catari Hernandez, with that broad global injection, I think of my friend Marta Moreno Vega there in the area between Santeria, Vodun, Caromblé, and the Ifa and the African from when it comes. You brought all that home in such a subtle way. So if y'all don't know what we're talking about, go get Racial Innocence, read this book, and your website, ProfessorTKH.com, right?
And I'm still on Twitter for as long as they'll have me, at Professor TKH.
No question. We don't have the option of surrendering tools, do we, Prof? We just got to fight wherever we can fight. We're on the battlefield. Prof, thank you so much for joining us here. And we hope you'll come back. And I know that, carving this time out, particularly at the end of the semester, I know is a great sacrifice. So thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Yes, indeed. Well, when we come back, we're going to clear the table and get ready for our next session here at the Black Table on the Black Star. Back in a moment.
These are the only bins that will accommodate larger overboard.
They put 10 in here?
10, and you don't come out till you die. And you eat every 10.
Oh my God.
In 1933, John Henry Clark, an 18-year-old who had hoboed his way from Union Springs, Alabama to New York City after having read an essay by the great Boricua scholar Arturo Schomburg called The Negro Digs Up His Past in the 1925 volume edited by Alain Locke called The New Negro. John Henry Clark made his way to New York looking for Arturo Schomburg, this Black Puerto Rican, and he found Schomburg at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. And Dr. Clark used to tell all of us, and he made this speech many times over his life, he said he went up to Mr. Schomburg, who was in the library that now bears his name, and in fact is a place that our guest today, Tanya Catari Hernandez, has worked with and at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. And he said, I want to learn the history of my people forthwith in the hour. And Dr. Clark said, Mr. Schomburg put his hands on his shoulders and said, son, what you're calling Black history or Negro history is really the history of the world. And if you study the history of your oppressor, you'll find out where they left you out, when they left you out, and why they left you out. That was Black-Brown unity. That was an Afro-Latino with an Afro-American from the United States. And in some ways that framed the rest of John Clark's life. And those of us who were his students benefited from that alliance and that natural converging of those two brothers. So Professor Hernandez is working in that tradition. She's building bridges. She's clearing out our capacity so that our capacity to mend and work together for a better world, in fact, will be realized. We're glad that she spent this hour with us. And come back next time. See us at the Black Table.